Good evening, everyone. On behalf of OCTAVE, I warmly welcome you to the third and the final session of OCTAVE Insights webinar series. OCTAVE is the John Keel's Group Data and Advanced Analytics Center for Excellence. My name is Duminder and I'll be your host today. I work as an analytics delivery lead at OCTAVE, who looks after the retail workstream. Let me introduce the speaker of the evening, Nair Khan, who is a global technical head of delivery at Quantum Black and an associate partner of McKinsey. Today, we intended to cover advanced analytics production readiness practices, which consist of production readiness practices process, some couple of case studies that we wanted to pick it up to explain this a little bit further, and the operating model, and most importantly, the machine learning ops process and continuous advanced analytics model maintenance and operations. We hope that this will be an interesting session, and please feel free to share your comments, experience, and questions on the Q&A feature, and we have a Q&A session at the end of our seminar. As you're probably aware, Microsoft is sponsoring a giveaway at each webinar in this series, and the webinar of the previous webinar, the winner of the previous webinar, which is the data science webinar, casual inference, is Pradeep Eranga Dissanayaka. Congratulations, Pradeep, on winning this. Nayu, over to you.
Super happy to kind of be here. This is a really amazing opportunity to talk about the end-to-end processes that are involved in terms of building advanced analytics, and really happy to speak here with my colleague Dominda. I think we're going to talk about a number of things here today. Dominda, do you want to just look at this end to end and just explain the whole context of what we're doing today, and then we'll dive straight into it?
Yeah, thanks, Nayu. So today what we intended to do is we conducted 2 webinars previously with regards to data science practices and also the data engineering practices. Today, what we are planning to run through is the end-to-end process in terms of how do we run an advanced analytics project from end to end, from starting on planning all the way up to the planning and coding, and then building, and also how do we test it. And we are going to talk a little bit about how do we deploy it, containerize it and deploy, and most importantly, how do you maintain and operate a machine learning model to create the best value for the business. Now over to you to go through the case study also. Yeah.
Okay, so let's anchor all of this on a really simple case study. And I got talking to Dominda a few weeks ago and found out that we both have a love of computer games. So we've made up an example, but it is based on something that is real. Suppose that we're looking for news and reviews, recommendations of latest type of computer games are out there. Obviously the PS5 is out there, the Xbox, new Xbox is out there. There's a lot of new games, a lot of buzz in the industry. And so how would we go about building something like this? And how is the AI going to infer the stuff that we're actually interested in? What does a recommendation system look like? And so if I look simply on data sources that we could possibly use, I mean, there's industry news, and that would get fed somewhere. There's like our network of friends. What are they interested in? I'm obviously interested in what Dominda's interested in. He's probably interested in what I'm interested in. But then we also have potentially our own likes and dislikes. Really like what particular quirks or what particular gaming types do we actually individually like? Like all of that would be processed by some kind of central storage engine, and there'll be some kind of data engineering pipeline that'll be feeding that into some kind of data science model, and then eventually that'll be published to some kind of end devices. Those devices might be some kind of mobile app or maybe even a laptop. So it's a really simple example, but I think we're going to use this to anchor a lot of the next few sections. And so when we talk about the end-to-end of analytics, what are we talking about here? And it's really trying to put together a holistic view end-to-end. How does this really look? And especially when we're talking about production and scale, given a lot of organizations have been actually experimenting or focusing on experimenting with building just data science models, But actually, there's more than just building a data science model. There's a lot there. And even in our simple use case earlier, there is a lot of moving parts that we need to actually get right. So really, this is about looking at, today's session is really about looking at the discipline and the end-to-end type practices, borrowing from what we know from software engineering, but also borrowing from DevOps and something that you'll be hearing a lot about, which is MLOps. So we start all the way at the beginning. And when we talk about planning and coding, what are the tools that we use to collaborate as teams, as cross-functional teams? Like, how do we write clean code? What are the kind of coding practices that need to happen? And like, how do we track our experiments, our models, like even the hyperparameters? Then we move on to building and testing. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about how do we automate this? How do we take what we've done before, but really bring it all together and have automation in this? And we'll be talking about something called continuous integration, or CI. Next, we move on to something on publishing and then deploying. Really, we've built, we've tested, we've trained our models, but now we want to package them into something. Now, what is that something, and what can we use? And then where do we store those models in such a way that we actually can use them to deploy them somewhere? And when we talk about deploying, is being able to deploy this into something that is a production-like environment, but really trying to remove the human from the loop and doing this in an automated fashion. So you've heard terms like from Daminda and myself about shifting left, about doing things on the left-hand side of this particular chart, and then pushing as quickly as possible to the right-hand side to production, into end users' hands. And finally, we're going to talk a lot about operations, and then the challenges that are unique to AI and machine learning, challenges like monitoring or retraining, being able to have insights or where there's problems. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's really trying to be able to diagnose things really, really quickly. So we're going to unpack a lot of these as we go through this webinar. And I'm just going to hand over back to my colleague. Daminda, do you want to add anything on this?
I think you have just covered the overall aspect of it and the most important parts of it. If you can move to the next slide, yeah.
Perfect.
Thanks. Go ahead, Nair.
Okay, so I'll do a brief, like a few minutes intro on planning and coding, and then, but it'd be really good to understand, like, what is OCTAVE doing? It'd be really understand what do you put in place? And so when I talk about planning and coding, if you remember what I said earlier around the tools that we use to collaborate, like being able to write clean code, and that involves a number of good kind of coding practices. Like at start level, I'd be pushing for version control, like really being able to collaborate more, not just with yourself, but with other team members, being able to share your work with others, like moving away from reinventing of the wheel, which we see a lot in organizations. There's other points around how do you structure your code. And when we talk about structure, ourselves at Quantum Black and McKinsey, we put together something called Kedro, which we use for structuring data engineering pipelines and data science models. This is around how do we structure a code in such a way that anyone else, any other data engineer or data scientist or software engineer can come along and actually look and actually understand, okay, I get what this is doing. I understand it's very well structured. There's things around code smells. What does good code look like? What are the kind of, and there's tools around this, like linting tools, maybe even code formatters, maybe even conventions that need to be there. And then there's really other tools that you could use to kind of validate this. Really what we're trying to push here is, what does good look like? What does good quality look like for an organization? And what is some of the things that we need to put in place to ensure that there's a high level of confidence here? I'm going to pause there. I'll pass it over to Daminda. I'm like really super interested in the spirit of discussion. Like what is it you've got in place, and what is your kind of thinking on all of this?
Yeah, thanks, Nair. So yes, in terms of the planning stage, even at OCTAVE, there are three things that we really look at in terms of when we are conducting a use case for the first time. First question that needs to be asked is, whenever we try to approach a problem, is what are we trying to solve, and why are we trying to solve it also, and who are the project sponsors and who are the subject matter experts around this, which is very, very important. It's always the responsibility of the data science, data engineering, as well as the entire delivery team to understand the business problem and understand what are we trying to solve with the help from the subject matter experts, because they will be having a better visibility and better understanding about what the problem is and what are we trying to solve also. Once when the problem is identified, that the data science team can resolve, the primary objective is to foster the maximum return on investment on an advanced analytics project. So making sure the planning stage is being really focused, do an ideation workshop, define the outcomes, what we are trying to solve, quantify the benefits to solve the problem is very, very important. The common approach that you could also take in creating the backlog and looking at the planning and establishing a use case output is find out what is the cost that it will take to getting it wrong against the benefits of getting it right. So when you understand and identify that, it's very, very easy to make sure that you are in the right path. You have the project sponsors onboarded. The value that you wanted to create to the business is being clearly identified. Constraints are being identified. Identify what is the low-hanging fruit that you can deliver quickly to the business and create that value. And also having those measurements and also capturing those measurements and delivering against those KPIs and measurements is also very important at early stages. Having said that, I'll probably say that at OCTAVE, on the use cases that what we deliver, we follow a clear iterative process. Continuous improvements throughout the delivery, adjusting the advanced analytics models and making sure the delivery is being done accordingly to the process that we have put in place, but also making sure that no assumptions are being taken into account and try to eliminate assumptions as much as possible so we can deliver the value to the business as much as possible during the planning stage. Also, finally, with regards to the project sponsors or the owners, make sure the business users understand what you're trying to deliver and how you are going to solve that problem or try to solve that problem. It's very, very important that you share this information with the business users because they will have a lot of information to share with you because they will be the subject matter experts to give us the direction and also to tell us whether we are in the right path in terms of agreeing for a value to deliver. So in terms of the planning, collaboration, etc., this is where we are working towards and we are practicing at OCTAVE, which is very successful in terms of the process that we follow now as we speak.
No, and that's fantastic. And just to kind of build upon that, I think like what I'm hearing is like data science models or building production type models doesn't happen in a bubble or in a silo. Like there is a lot of collaboration backwards and forwards between a business, a bunch of stakeholders, and also the engineering team that are building this. Would you say that was fair?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it's a one team concept that needs to go in.
No, absolutely. And then if you want to double click a little bit in terms of some of the coding practices we just talked about a little bit around version control and unit testing, what are some of the practices that you put in place from the engineering aspect point of view?
Yeah, so I would probably like to share a little bit thoughts around and also would like to hear from you in terms of at Quantum, Black & McKenzie, what are the best practices that we use in terms of the global best practices for us, for you guys, what are you guys are practicing in terms of advanced analytics model creation. At OCTAVE, we do have a clear defined process in terms of DevOps environment that we manage all the version controlling using Git repositories. And as you also explained, the plan of us is to shift the quality left as much as possible and automate as much as possible. So making sure that the unit testing is being automated as early as possible and identify the issues, identify the gaps, and how do we rectify them as early as possible. And in terms of documentation, there's quite a lot of documentation that goes into it, but we intended to and we try to automate as many documentations as possible. So by the time when we deliver it, there's no extra effort to it. And also there will be very less technical debt associated with whatever we deliver across to the business. So I'll probably say that three things that we can probably take away on what we practice is iterate as much as possible, collaborate as much as possible, and appreciate what you do as much as possible. So, and also hold regular problem solving sessions is a key distinction in terms of delivering value to the business. because the more problem solving specific sessions that you conduct on all these aspects of creating the code, creating the algorithms to deliver the business value is very, very important. Iterate it, validate it. If it doesn't work, go back, look at the data, have a problem solving session and resolve it and deliver to the business on time is the general concept and the process that we follow in these processes.
No, that sounds fantastic, and a lot of those practices is what we kind of preach. I really think where we're coming from is to try and standardize what we're doing, because like, if you're doing it with one team, it's fine, but really what we're talking about is multiple teams following a certain standard, a certain type of pattern to push things as quickly as possible into users' hands. And so with that, I mean, let's move swiftly on to kind of building and testing. And to build on a point that Dominda just mentioned around automation, like this is such a key point to a lot of this. And I still find this working with lots of different clients in various different industries. There's a lot of manual churn that happens here. Like data science models or data engineering pipelines are kind of handcrafted, and then it's hand built. Testing is hand done. And really, there are lots of different tools out there. But when I talk about continuous integration, like for those unaware, I mean, this is really an automated way of actually running tests, building, verifying, running code quality checks, security reviews, throw it all in there. And the technologies have been around for probably as long as my career, about 20 years plus. So really, there's a lot of good things out there. I'm really super interested, and I think everyone listening will be super interested in what is Octave doing in this regard. I know you're doing a lot in terms of automation.
Yeah. So in terms of continuous integration, as I touched base a few minutes before, we actually use entire Azure pipelines in terms of having JIT hooks and making sure that we have a standard structure in our JIT repositories. So everything that's been built, developed around in the iterative process has been rigorously tested and peer reviewed. And also certain linting libraries are also being associated with it. And once when you try to promote the code from the dev branches to the release branches, they automatically would run through and then give the results across through the Azure DevOps environments to the developers. So this will probably help the developer itself to identify some of the issues that they come across and also to rectify some of those issues as early as possible and give solutions to those problems as early as possible. And this also gives an advantage, like when you wanted to deliver an MVP for a pilot to identify if there's anything that needs to be looked at early as possible. And sometimes there are instances where you define a value at the beginning of the planning stage, but when you iteratively run it with the actual data sets, you come across situations where the value needs to be adjusted and you have to go back to the business and also explain it. But overall, in terms of the building, we use Azure DevOps pipelines across from end to end. And also in terms of testing and code quality checks, we also use some third-party tools, but most of the tools and libraries what we use, some of them are open source components, but there are certain ones that's been built into Azure DevOps environment, which we inherit and use it as it is. A couple of important areas that we put a lot of emphasis across is on the CI/CD front, where we wanted to make sure that anything that we built, the human interference that comes across to it is being minimized as much as possible. One aspect of it is to make sure that the data that what we use in the production environments are being kept separately from the dev environments. And also the models that we push across to the production or the high environments like development, UAT, and also in the production environments, the separate environments are being kept as separately as much as possible. And also to make sure that in terms of DR setups, that the rollback plans are also being looked at when we continuously integrate and then push across machine learning models across to production. Now, just out of curiosity, I would also like to understand a little bit more about in terms of the CI/CD practices and unit testing and the automated testing practices that at Quantum Black that you guys are practicing, which might be very interesting to our audience as well as all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, just to build on what you've said, I think you're got a really good foundation of doing a lot of these practices as we are. I think it comes back to the previous point around the coding. If you're getting the right type of ways of using the code, clean code, using tools like Kedro, writing unit tests in the right place, and not writing unit tests for the sake of unit tests, but actually really thinking about like what is the most important things that I need to test. Identifying code smells early on, identifying using linting tools or code formatters. All of these automatically get rolled up into your CI process. And really the CI is there as a to do two things. I would say one, it's obviously running things automatically in the background, and that's important simply because in some cases, some of these models, they take a long time to train. They take a long time to run tests on. I'm not sure in your case, Daminda, like how long do they take to train? But like I've seen cases where models could take 8 to 10 hours, and you don't want teams or individuals to be sitting around waiting around for that. So there's one benefit. The second is it's around integrating all of these different things. So it's a level above this. In the previous example that we talked about, and I know it's a really simple example, but we are taking in data engineering pipelines. We're taking like 3 different feeds. We're taking some news feeds. We're taking our friends' feeds. We're taking even our likes and dislikes into something. And so we're trying to bring that all together, and then we're pushing that, building features, and then pushing that into some kind of model. Like this, there's a bunch of integration that's going on here. And from a CI point of view, we're integrating as well. So we're verifying all these moving parts actually work and join together. So I think it's not just building and testing and the approach, but it's also integrating and working in a cohesive, collaborative way with other individuals. So to answer your question in a simple way, like I think you're doing exactly the right thing. And as you'll go on, you're kind of building the foundation for how all other teams will be working in OCTAVE.
Just around testing, also the common questions that would come around with regards to the machine learning model testing, because typically what happens is machine learning models would have like an accuracy rate across, right? So there's always right as well as wrong. So when we run through the iterative process, where do you think that there's a cutoff in terms of the development process life cycle on the production readiness practices, that okay, this is the cutoff point for us to move across to the piloting on an A/B test or a test control set? Would like to understand a little bit more on this, so it'll be quite interesting in terms of the common challenges that comes across specifically on testing, and where do we really take the cutoff to move across and start challenging with the production data in terms of it.
Yeah, so this is an interesting point, and I'm glad you brought this up. And so the way I think we've been doing it at Quantum Black, and how I work with a lot of my clients, is that the concept of like you have your environment, you have your dev, you have your QA, you have your prod. But in terms of data, regardless of which environment you're in, underpinning that is the same production data backbone. And let me repeat that. It is the same production data lake or data backbone that underpins these 3 environments. It makes very little sense to copy the data from a production environment to a dev environment and build your models, or it makes very little sense because that's operationally expensive, and it makes very little sense to actually train or build models on test or dummy data, just because that's not real either. And so like if we want to remove those kind of sticking points, we've started pushing clients towards this thinking of, look, machine learning is slightly different. Like it has to have production data there. Like, do you want to spend like a lot of operational effort copying data around and then realize like the data that you built it and trained it on is not the same as production, which is like one of the main fail cases? Or do you want to actually try and simplify your environment, but have the same data backbone, same data lake, allow your developers, your engineers, your data engineers, your data scientists to actually access that production data, build and experiment on that inside a development environment, and then also just push that forward, because then you're confident that there's not going to be a data issue there. There's actually going to be is going to work as you expect. Now, this might not be practical for every single industry, but like we've seen clients starting to move towards this just because it is slightly different to a traditional software engineering stack. I'll pause there. There'll probably be lots of questions on this. This is probably it's probably a webinar in itself. Like, how do you govern it? How do you access controls? But like, again, it comes back to this point with machine learning models and building stuff. I mean, we're here. What we're talking about, we have a development environment. We're building, we're testing, we're training. We have to do it in production data, and so why would you start copying things around? Just give access. And I've simplified it a lot. There are a lot of constraints, and I'm sure there's industry spins on compliance as well. We can unpack that probably in the Q&A later a little bit.
Sure, man. Thanks.
All right. So I mean, with that, I mean, let's move on to publishing and deploying. And again, this is really now building off what we've just talked about. So we've built, we've tested, we've trained our AI models. We've got our data pipelines. Like, first, we need to package them somewhere. And like, how are we going to package these successfully? What are we going to use? And I think this is where containers have started to come in handy a lot. I mean, there are other solutions out there, but we've seen lots of clients move towards the use of containers. And when I'm talking about containers, I'm talking about maybe using something like Docker to package up and create containers. Docker's been around for a long time to doing this. There are other ways of creating containers, just probably as stable. But really, we've seen this become a pattern to package up our data engineering pipelines, our AI models into something that can be reused and also roll back at some point. There are many DevOps practices and teams that are able to use these technologies and use Docker containers today. They work in environments which are, you might have heard of the terms like Kubernetes. They work in environments like that. And there's lots of ways of actually, once you have these containers, to store them, like either store them on a file system or store them in some kind of repo, even some of those asset type repositories. Like, containers make sense. Then it's actually taking those containers and using the same technology we talked about before in terms of continuous integration, but being able to ultimately deploy them into a running environment. And again, I'm going to move away from doing things manually. I think while there are teams out there and industries out there, organizations out there in the world that still rely on a separate build and a run team, like, this throwing over the wall mentality is disappearing slowly. And I think we're looking towards, well, how are the tech giants doing this? And automation, continuous deployment, you might have heard continuous delivery. These are key technologies for actually removing the human in the loop and being able to automate this. I'll pause there, and we'll come back to consuming and serving in a bit. But I love to understand, Daminda, like, some of your thoughts on this and what OCTAVE is doing.
Absolutely, thanks. So when we initially started, we were actually using the Azure pipelines in terms of pushing across the ADF pipelines as well as the machine learning models into production environments using the Azure DevOps built-in pipelines. But we eventually moved across from that approach to Docker, because the reason is that it's easy to port the entire package and its dependency files based on it. Whether you use TensorFlow, whether you use whatever the other machine learning frameworks or Conda environment or whatever you are using, it's always easier to use it and port it across. And sometimes there will be instances where multiple business units might use the same machine learning model, maybe an input from a machine learning model to the output of another machine learning model. So hence, it was very, very important for us to make sure that we packaged our machine learning models as well as the data pipelines and everything around it with the dependency files and pushed across to the production. One other advantage what we have also experienced is it's easier to manage it, and maintainability is relatively very high. And also for us to automate the process from one end to the other end in terms of the production readiness practices, it has been quite easy for us to deliver a solution within a very short period of time across to the production with the security and the integrity and the dependencies that we wanted to put in place.
No, absolutely. I mean, it sounds fantastic, and it's kind of a trend that we're seeing. A lot of teams moving towards using Docker just because of its portability. And sorry, let me reframe it, towards containers because of its portability. Docker is a little bit more than just containers as a technology. But if I talk about serving and consuming, I just want to touch on these two. And I think this is a really subtle point, and it's super important about before you actually build the AI model. It's almost like working your way backwards. And this comes back to the point I think Daminda was mentioning in the beginning about working with stakeholders. like, how are these AI models, these machine learning models, going to be used? Like, how are they actually going to be embedded into business processes and people are going to get the benefit from them? So if we go back to our really simple example earlier, we had this recommender example, and that was actually pushing recommendations to our website or our mobile device. So there's a push element, but then maybe you want the same AI model to be called via an API. Maybe you want to make it open, and so that another team can actually use the benefit of what you're building, and embed that into their downstream system. And so they'll call it via some kind of API. I think where I'm trying to push is around the thinking from an MLOps, from an infrastructure point of view, on like standardizing on like the handful of archetypes that you might actually use. And then the first time you'll build something around, let's say I want to push information out from a model to a mobile device, it might take you time to build it. But the second time you're building a new model for something else, but you still want to push to a mobile device, that you could actually leverage the learnings and also the infrastructure that was actually put in place. So this is really about scaling and the thinking around scaling. I'm really trying to avoid, it's kind of putting the engineering mindset and all of this, and really trying to avoid like reinventing the wheel or having many teams actually rebuilding the same thing again and again and again, but just doing it differently, which actually costs the organization much more. I'm going to pause there. I'd really love to understand, Daminda, like some of the thinking around the serving and the consuming of AI models. Like, what is OCTAVE doing right now in terms of that?
Yeah, I think that's the most interesting in terms of how do you really serve and consume the AI models in terms of outputs, and how do you really generate the value that is required for the business. So most of the advanced analytics machine learning models that we've been developing for multiple business units is either it's a presentation layer that goes out with some information that is relevantly input to and decision making for the senior management or the executives in the departments, where they will probably look at in terms of the outputs, the predictions, or the risk assessments, or some recommendations that gets generated throughout the business. And also it carries the value if you put across those recommendations. So I'll probably say that most of the advanced analytics models that's been built so far and continues to build will be having a presentation layer for the business, and also an implementation recommendations that goes out with it for different business units and with different business operations in terms of doing it. But having said that, there can also be machine learning advanced analytics models that could also propose certain process changes, certain maybe as example on the retail field, there can be like a space and assortment on a store. So certain recommendations like that could also be pushed across based on some kind of like algorithms that you put across in your data science models. But predominantly, it will be a presentation or an input to another model that would consume that and then gives a better output to create the required value for the business. And please do raise all your questions using the Q&A section on Teams, and we will spend some time at the end of the session to answer most of the questions that comes across, and we'll be able to take it up and probably have a constructive conversation across that.
Fantastic. Okay, so I think we're going to move on to operating now. So just to kind of recap, we talked earlier about planning and the tools and stuff that were involved in that to enable cross-functional teams to actually work together. Then there is the whole coding and around clean coding and data and quality of what we're actually producing. There's a whole push around continuous integration and using tools to kind of build, test, train AI models and data engineering pipelines. Then there's a whole thing around publishing and deploying it. Now we've got something running in a kind of a production environment, and this is really where we're talking about operations, and this is really where I think the crux of some of the challenges exist. And so I'll start with monitoring, and this really being a like super important type of topic. Like AI models at their best suffer from brittleness, and brittleness in terms of the data engineering pipelines, the data that flows in, and something called data drift. And really, if I'll unpack that, that's when something happens to the input of the data that affects the model's prediction accuracy. So in our example, we have our really simple recommendation engine. It's getting news from external data sources. Well, what happens if something happened to our external data feed, like our news feed? What if it wasn't behaving as we expect it to behave? Like, this might actually cause problems for what we're actually getting recommended. We might get wrong kind of recommendations. I'll give you another example, and I think many here on the call and many may have experienced it this year. Models are trained on production data, on real data, on historical data, to kind of give them an ability to predict this is what may happen in the future based on what I've seen on the past. When COVID hit, most models that were trained on historical type of data that had to predict some kind of behavior suddenly started to become irrelevant or challenging in the wild. And simply because when COVID hit, behaviors in the world suddenly started to change rapidly. So buying patterns, spending patterns, where people were eating, what people were doing, what people were reading, where they were traveling to, like any kind of forecasting model that you might have built based on historical data, years of historical data, may suddenly become null and void. And this is a really extreme example of data drift, but it is a valid example. And I think most people would kind of understand this one. So really where I'm coming back to is monitoring rigorous monitoring is really super important. Like, it's really difficult to know, we had a really simple example with our recommender use case earlier, but without rigorous monitoring, it's difficult to know like what events have happened to cause changes in your AI model. So I'm going to just pause there. I would love to like Daminda to comment on this in some of the things that they put in place, some of the DevOps and MLOps type practices and processes.
Thanks, David. So I'll probably say the MLOps, it's not a product or a service, it's more or less like a concept that we run through in terms of the overall advanced analytics projects. So I think it do covers certain areas like training reusability in terms of how do you really reuse some of the components, some of the aspects of it to make sure that your maintainability of the models. It's a typical DevOps setup, but it's for machine learning. So it's very important that we look at the training reusability of the data sets that we use. Going back into what you discussed about, it's about using the production data and how do we really use it, and how do you make sure that you set the expectations across to the business in terms of how do we reuse some of those data that runs through the machine learning models in the live environment to retrain the models. And also one of the other aspects, key aspects that we also do is how do we track the data sets on our pipelines. It's very important and common issue that comes across, and we have also experienced is when we consume third-party APIs for some data sets. There are situations where there can be like duplicate data. There can be issues with regards to data being corrupted, which feeds into the production environment, and then they gives ad hoc results where the business might take decisions based on. So having those right tools, having those right monitoring triggers put in place to give proactive triggers to the business as well as the support teams, the ML DevOps teams, is very, very important to make sure that we sustain a constant throughput for the models that we use. And also the coding and the experiment practices and the model registry, it's very, very important that we follow that also in the aspect and also run through that. So it's overall in terms of MLOps as well as the other aspects, I think it's very, very important that we run through this, and the process that we follow is also very similar to that. And it has given a very sustainable model across for overall process that we follow from end-to-end aspect.
No, that's fantastic. And I think I'll just kind of round it off with one more kind of thought process, and maybe good to hear, Daminda, your views on this, is in terms of live operations. So there's a model, it's embedded, it's doing something, it's maybe in our use case, it was publishing to a kind of a mobile website, a mobile device or a website. We're getting some recommendations. It's behaving a little bit funny. Users are complaining. Like, how do we track this? Who's tracking this? And so this, like, there's two kind of views on this. There's kind of the product mentality view. And so as you're building AI models all the way from the beginning of what we talked about today, from the planning, coding, you have this cross-functional teams. They're responsible end to end. You might have heard the term pizza teams. They're responsible end to end, and also to see this into production, and also continuously to iterate on this, because it's more than just a model. It's there's a pipeline, there's an application on top. It's a product in itself. So there's that view. The other view is actually you're building a model and some pipelines, but actually you're just building an API, and then you're going to hand it over to some kind of operations team, maybe some kind of level 1, level 2 support type of team, and then you're going to arm them with a FAQ and a bunch of other tools to help them diagnose problems quickly. But still, at some point, you're going to get called back when there's expertise needed to diagnose things. I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Daminda. Like, where are you today, and where do you see yourself going with this?
I think where we are heading in terms of the overall processes, from the code and deployment process all the way in terms of packaging, validating the model in terms of A/B testing and piloting, is when we start the piloting itself, we actually look at certain aspects of it and start institutionalizing some of those aspects into the process itself. So when we push across to the production, there's nothing new that we need to bring it in. So we make sure that during the pilot itself, where you really test some of these models and run through the iterative process itself, we bring in some of these aspects into it. So it will allow us to change the attributes, and also to tailor the process according to the business requirements. So you would not see any hiccups, or you would not see any challenges that you will come across when you try to push something into the production. If the pilot is all good, then the business wants to consume it on the production scale. So this is where I see that always there's a challenge and a conflict that gets created when we don't think through in terms of how do we really put this in place, how does your MLOps works for, and what is your business continuity plan in terms of machine learning models that you deploy to the production, because the reason is business is going to depend on some of these outputs, and maybe they have some SLAs that goes with it, and the business may depend on certain decisions that they make, especially in a situation like this. And hence, it's always important for us to test it as early as possible. So moving the quality left, being prepared, not to take any assumptions, have those monitoring platforms in place, have those MLOps processes in place, have those individuals understand who is the owner of everything, and setting the right expectations to the business in terms of coming back into is very, very important for us.
Fantastic. So I think that kind of rounds off like a whirlwind tool of like end to end. Like what does good look like end to end, and what are others in the world doing? What is OCTAVE doing? I think here we have a question now for our audience, and I'll kind of recap if I get this right. Like the winner will be selected at random, and from the correct response will receive a gift sponsored by Microsoft. So there's a lot to play for here. So the question is, can you name a challenge we need to monitor which is unique to AI models? We just talked about it about 5 minutes ago. so pro tip, please do send in the answers to octave at keels.com before the end of the day tomorrow. The winner will be announced on your LinkedIn page. I think that's right, by the end of the week. Is that right, Daminda?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, there are some very interesting questions that some of our audience has posted. Nuan has asked question, what's your proposed approach for the model risk governance? I think that's a very, very interesting question in terms of it, because risk, when you're working with production data, how do you make sure your model risk governance is being maintained? So would like to hear a little bit more thoughts from you in terms of what are the common practices that you put in place at McKinsey as well as in Quantum Black in terms of these challenges. How do you really manage the risks associated with governance in some of these machine learning models?
Yeah, no, and that's a really good question, and I think like the simplistic answer, it depends, and it's becoming a much more important topic. Recently, we did a study and we put that on our website in terms of the state of AI. Risk still is not as big a topic as we would like it to be, and risk has many lenses. So when we talk about the governance of these models and really trying to understand like what data was used, how was that built, like who did this, like there is lots of metadata that's actually collected in terms of from a technical practices point of view, all the way down to like I built a particular model with these particular data sets and these are the versions, a time series of the actual data itself that was used, so that I could actually go back in time and look at this and be able to prove to an auditor someplace how it was done. So those are technical practices around it, but then there's a kind of operational side of this, and so this is where I feel again part of the whole AI movement. There's a kind of a gap in terms of organizations and a lot of their thinking in terms of like, what do I need to stand up in terms of a governance for this? Like you must have heard of like governance for data. And still organizations are struggling with getting this right because data is exploding at a huge rate. Like risk governance is an emerging topic that requires a lot of attention, that requires people to own it, that requires people to actually understand when we talk about the governance here, what do we need to look at? We also need to look at things inside the data. So if you're building something that's, let's say, our recommender model, we are building stuff, like, was there any data bias inside it? And so there's a whole ethics stuff side that needs to be considered, like especially when we talk about compliance. So I'm going to come back to it depends. It's an emerging topic. There's technical practices that you could definitely employ in what we've covered today, and really to capture kind of metadata and be able to trace things back and be able to prove and audit everything. But then there's a whole operational side around with people and process that also needs to be put in place, that also needs to be quite rigorous in certain organizations, and there would be more rigorous checks than other organizations.
Thanks, Now. Now, there's also a very interesting question that has come up. Is there any unified agreed upon process for data analytics? I've seen this being a challenge in most of the organizations, but I would really like to hear from you in terms of broader answer. How do we really challenge some of these things?
Yeah, no. So look, it's an emerging topic, and like I'll start high level with the technology itself. There is no one platform to rule them all. I've started this and saying this a lot to people. Yes, there's lots of good technologies out there. There's lots of things out there in terms of how you develop stuff, and there's lots of good things out there in how you kind of productionize stuff and build models. But there is no one platform that rules them all. We just talked earlier about how the data lake or the data backbone, it should underpin both of these things. So on the technology side, there's lots of options, and really there's no clear winner right now today. In terms of people and process, I think there's a lot of effort that's been put on in terms of what does a data science project look like, or a data engineering project. How is it similar to a software engineering project, but at the same time slightly different? How is it we can actually borrow tools from DevOps? And bear in mind, like DevOps has been around for 15 years or so. It's been around for a very, very long time. There's been a lot of tools that we're kind of reusing. And then there's lots of things around the MLAPs stuff, which has been, I mean, I've personally been talking about it for about 4 years. And now we've started to see a lot recently, because there's a lot of challenges with ML models, AI models in production that are slightly different than what DevOps can handle. So the simple answer is it's an emerging field. It's changing all the time. Technology is changing rapidly, and I always look at it as finding what works for you. And if I come back to how Domindo's been thinking about it at OCTAVE with the rest of the team, I think they've got a process, they've got an approach that is working for them. They've chosen a bunch of technologies, but they're also happy, if I understood right, that they tried certain technologies, they've moved away from them, trying something else that works better for them. I think this is all about continuous learning, continuous improvement on yourself, and really challenging, like, is this the right way of doing things?
Thanks, Dan. So there's one more interesting question. I think you touched base also on this is AI ethics. I mean, it's a global standard that you follow, but it's a new thing that's that's been rolling out. Would like to hear a little bit more on this in terms of what is your experience around it and what are the common practices that's been rolled out by large scale organizations, specifically who are practicing on machine learning models.
Yeah, so we actually have a special group in Quantum Black who's actually looking at this topic specifically, like very closely, and ethics is super important. You know, I think there's lots of things in the news, and I don't want to comment too much on them, but there's lots of things in the news around like what are models being used for. There's also a lot of paranoia out there about how they should be used, how they can actually do things, and how really they should be governed. I think we personally are looking at these topics carefully. There are certain things that industries where we'll work with very closely, and there's other industries where we won't feel comfortable to actually work with, and really questioning, like, is this really the right thing to do? Is this really going to help? Is this really going to cause an impact in the world, or is it going to cause problems? I think, like, with all of these things, the good thing that I can really talk about is we have a special area that we're looking at these and looking at all of these questions carefully, and also evaluating the work that we do with clients. It's a topic that's emerging. We know that clients are also looking at this. If I just talk about data bias as an example, we have seen issues where models, and bear in mind what I said earlier, models are trained on historical data. Well, what if the data had lots of bias in it? It was towards one type of gender or one type of stereotype, and then started spitting out things which said, well, the model said this, and therefore it must be right, but it's not right. And so there's a lot of things here to unpack, and I think it's an emerging trend that we will keep on top of. But we'll also advise our clients in the best way possible about what they should be considering as well.
Thanks. There's also one, I'll probably join these two questions together. More questions are around basically about what is the ideal set of roles that is required to roll out a process like this, and how long would a process like this would take to roll it out to an organization, whether it's a large or a small scale.
So these are really difficult questions to answer and say, look, here's the one answer and this is it. And like, it all depends on the organization, depends on the people, process, how they actually work. And so the mindset, I work with lots of different types of organizations all around the world in various different types of industries. And really, you know, like my first question is, like, again, coming back to the roles and the talent they have there today. So, like, at basic level, you have your data engineers and your data scientists. I think everyone is converged on, look, you need those two type of roles. Then there is the analytics type translator role. And really, this is about translating analytics benefits between business stakeholders and also the tech teams, and really trying to unpack, you know, the importance of analytics and what is the art of possible. I would always argue towards pushing towards a product mindset versus a project mindset, and so this is really a product manager and working side by side with a tech lead, and then there's the element of the kind of platforms that you're doing this in, and so there is I would say DevOps type skills. Even though DevOps is also a mindset, I know that actually industry has converged a little bit in saying that there's skills involved. We talked about MLOps, and so the MLOps is like an emerging area. There are very few MLOps practitioners in the world that I can see you can hire for today, because there are unique type skills, but really the underlying skills are like operations knowledge, understanding of some of these cloud technologies, if you're in cloud or on-premise, maybe even Linux based, really understanding like how to do this and how to debug and then some of the data things that you need to put on top. So coming back to the question, I can't answer how long it would take because it depends on the organization, but let me paint a very simple one. I'm working with a client who who's doing stuff at a global level, across 5 or 6 different countries with 5 or 6 different teams. Like about 25 to 40 types of models are being built at one time. They're pumping out production releases every 2 weeks, like at scale, because like the first 5 or 6 took time, took 6 months or so maybe to kind of build infrastructure, the process, the onboarding of people and whatnot. And remember, it's a people, process, talent type of view. And then as you start to scale up, you're kind of reusing everything. You're reusing the processes that you have in place. You're augmenting this with better processes. You're continuously learning. And now they're pumping out changes into production every 2 weeks. This is either changes in the model, adding new features, adding new data sets, or actually improvements on the product itself in the various different types of countries. So like that is good. And we would love to get even better with that. But I think that I'm hoping that we'll push towards, if you look at where you are today, is that something that you can get to very soon?
Thanks, Nairo. I think we have time for one more question, which is like a common question that comes across. It's more or less how do you manage the resistance and the skepticism of business with regards to machine learning models as well as advanced analytics models that gets rolled out. So if you could share a little bit of thoughts in terms of the best practices that you probably run through to take the business on board as well as the users on board in terms of when you roll out advanced analytics use case out to the business.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this comes back to the question that was asked earlier as well, and just something that Daminda said, is that, look, there's a kind of cross-functional team here. There's obviously a team building this, but there's stakeholders involved. There's a lot of like shaping of this involved up front with the stakeholders. And if I use the anchoring of having a product manager or someone really like who's probably one of the most toughest roles possible to balance stakeholder input, to balance your tech team, to balance other kind of considerations, but really trying to, along with those translators, trying to bring the end users on the journey. And so the way I would always frame this, and what I've seen work well at organizations, you might have a model. It might be absolutely perfect in terms of prediction, but actually there's a kind of a rejection point from the end users because, look, I know better. I've done my job for 20 years. Why would you tell me any different? And so this is almost like there's another disruption that needs to happen, another kind of onboarding, and that one takes time because it's around people. And so it's always like, look, don't think of this as the autopilot. Think of this as a co-pilot. Still make your decisions, but like, does the AI agree? Can we open the black box so that you can understand and what the AI is suggesting? So this is around explainability of how it's come to that decision. I think that kind of co-pilot approach is really, really good. We've seen it work a lot well with clients over a period of time until they're comfortable with the results, to the point where, okay, I'm happy with the AI having one hand on the steering wheel. Now I'm happy with the AI actually now taking over and having two hands on the steering wheel because it's making the right decisions. And now I can go and do other things because now that is taking care of one aspect of my role. I think like that is the point. It is not, there's a lot of, like I said in my earlier point, there's a lot of paranoia about, how far can we take AI? Is it going to disrupt people's jobs? That's not the point. And I think it's part of this whole way of we work with each other. We're not just building models and saying, here you go. It's actually working and encouraging the use, but having it there as a co-pilot before eventually adopting it properly. And really, this comes back to user feedback. This comes back to bringing them along on the journey, not at the end of the journey.
Thanks, Nairo. I think this comes up to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much, Nairo, for joining the session today. And please do remember to send all the answers to the giveaway question to Octave at Keels at the end of the day tomorrow. As Nairo said, we will announce the winners on Friday the 18th on the Octave LinkedIn page. Also, before you wind up for the day, please fill in the feedback form. The link will be posted on the chat box. Hope to see you at the future events organized by Octave. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night. Bye.
Thank you all.